45 million Americans check a box on the census that says German. It is the single largest ancestry group in the United States, bigger than English, bigger than Irish, bigger than Italian and Mexican combined. And almost none of them know where it actually started. Not the wave of Germans who came through Ellis Island in the 1880s. The first wave, the one that happened 137 years before Ellis Island even existed. In July of 1683, a ship left Rotterdam carrying 13 families who did not speak a word of English, who had been pushed out of their homeland for their faith, and who were about to found a settlement 6 miles outside a town called Philadelphia. Historians call that ship the German Mayflower. Most Americans have never heard its name. The ship was called the Concord. And if your family has been in this country a long time, and somewhere in that story there is a name like Graeff, or Kunders, or Rittenhouse, this is where it began. 20 surnames. Some of them still exist exactly as they were spelled in 1683. Some of them changed so much you would never guess the connection. One of them belongs to a family whose kitchen table hosted the writing of the first formal protest against slavery in American history, more than a century before abolition became a national conversation, a document that was then lost for 150 years and rediscovered twice. Is one of these names in your family tree? Stay with me and subscribe to the channel right now, because we do this every week. To understand who these 13 families were, you have to understand what they were running from. Most of them came from Krefeld, a small weaving town on the Lower Rhine that had become one of the only places in Germany where Mennonites and Quakers could practice their faith without being arrested for it. Even there, the tolerance was fragile. When William Penn traveled through the Rhineland in 1677, recruiting settlers for his new Pennsylvania colony, he found in Krefeld a community of linen weavers who had spent 2 generations being fined, jailed, and driven out of one town after another for refusing to baptize their infants and refusing to swear oaths. Penn's offer was simple. Come to Pennsylvania, and no one will ever ask you to violate your conscience again. 13 families accepted. They sold their looms, their houses, and in some cases, everything they owned. And in July of 1683, they boarded a 3-masted merchant ship named the Concord under an English captain named William Jeffreys. The crossing from Rotterdam through Gravesend and London to Philadelphia took 75 days. They landed on October 6, 1683, greeted by a German lawyer named Francis Daniel Pastorius, who had sailed ahead of them months earlier to negotiate the land. Once they arrived, the 13 families did not fight over who got the best land. Under Pastorius' supervision, they pooled every acre they had purchased and drew lots to decide who would settle where. A small act of collective humility from people who had just survived a 2.5-month ocean crossing together. Over the following months, they cleared timber, built rough shelters, and planted their first crop of flax, the plant their entire trade back in Krefeld had been built around. Number 1, Graeff. 3 brothers boarded the Concord in 1683, Dirk, Herman, and Abraham Graeff, weavers from Krefeld, all 3 grandsons of a Mennonite, lay preacher who had led his community for decades. The brothers bought 2,000 acres of Pennsylvania land from a fellow Krefeld man named Jacob Telner while they were still standing in Europe, sight unseen on the strength of a promise from William Penn. Dirk became the settlement's chief executive in 1693. Herman became its town president in 1689. But it is what happened in the spring of 1688 that made this family's name matter to American history far beyond Germantown. Dirk and Abraham, along with Pastorius and one other Quaker named Garrett Hendricks, drafted a document arguing that slavery violated the Golden Rule, that no person who believed in freedom of conscience for himself had the right to deny it to another human being. They brought it to their local Quaker meeting. The meeting passed it up the chain to the quarterly meeting, then to the yearly meeting, the highest Quaker authority in the colony. And there, the leadership of the Religious Society of Friends looked at the first formal protest against slavery ever written in the American colonies, and they tabled it, called it a matter too general to decide. It disappeared into the Philadelphia Yearly Meetings archive and stayed there unread for almost 150 years. It was rediscovered by accident in 1844 by a Philadelphia antiquarian named Nathan Kite, who published it in a religious journal just as the American abolitionist movement was gathering force, more than a century and a half after 2 weavers from Krefeld had first put their names on it. The document then vanished again for most of the 20th century, before being found a second time in 2005, folded, torn at the edges, and fading inside a vault at the Arch Street Meeting House in Philadelphia. 2 men who arrived in America owning almost nothing wrote 4 sentences that the country was not ready to hear for over 150 years. The Graeff name did not survive the way it was spelled. Descendants anglicized it into Updegraff, Updegrove, and Updegraft, scattering across Pennsylvania and Ohio. One of those descendants, generations later, became the governor of Pennsylvania. If your family carries any version of that name, The line runs back to brothers from Krefeld who put their names on paper against slavery before almost anyone else in the country was willing to. Number 2, Arets. Leonard Arets was a weaver who crossed with his family and built a life in Germantown that lasted more than 30 years. His will, filed in December of 1714, is one of the most detailed surviving legal records from the original settlement, naming his 3 daughters, Catherine, Margaret, and Elizabeth Ann, as his executors, with Catherine having married into a family named Jones. The witnesses listed on that will include Francis Daniel Pastorius himself. Reading Leonard Arets' will today, you are reading a document witnessed by the man who founded Germantown. Number 3, Streypers. Willem Streypers came over single, one of the only unmarried men on the Concord's passenger list. He came from a respected Reformed church family in Kaldenkirchen, one whose elders had held positions of civic trust in the old country for generations, and several of his brothers, Peter, Leonard, and Jan Streypers, followed him to Pennsylvania in the years after. American genealogists have long believed those same Streypers brothers had sisters who married directly into the Kunders, Lucken, and Arets households, which means that within 2 generations, Streypers' blood ran through nearly every one of Germantown's founding surnames. Number 4, Kunders. Thons Kunders, whose name was later anglicized to Dennis Conrad, ran a dye house on the main road through Germantown, and it was inside Thons Kunders' own home that the small group of Germantown Quakers gathered in April of 1688 to write and sign the document you just heard about, the first formal protest against slavery in American colonial history. It was not written in a courthouse or a church. It was written at a kitchen table in the house of a dye maker from the Rhineland who had been in the country less than 5 years. Kunders' daughter Anna, born in July of 1684, is recorded as the first child born to the Krefeld settlers on American soil. Number 5, Tyson, originally Tyson. Rainier Tyson crossed as a single man, one of several relatives connected through the Doerrs family of Krefeld. His sisters had married into the Kunders, Keurlis, and Lucken households, which meant that within the first Germantown generation, several of the 13 founding families were already related to each other before they ever left Europe. Number 6, Seimens, later spelled Seimens and Seimens. Jan Seimens did not survive the first winter. He died in January of 1684, the first adult male among the original settlers to die on American soil, leaving behind his widow, Merchant Willemsen, who was pregnant at the time. She gave birth to their son, Peter, months after his father's death, a child who never met the man whose name he carried into the next 3 centuries of Pennsylvania, Seimens and Seimens families. Number 7, Lensen. Jan Lensen is one of the 13 original family heads, about whom almost nothing personal survives. No will, no detailed land dispute, no dramatic first winter story. Just a name on the passenger reconstruction and a plot of Germantown land. A reminder that not every founding family left a paper trail, and that absence from the record does not mean absence from the bloodline. Number 8, Keurlis, sometimes recorded as Curlin. Peter Keurlis married into the Doerrs family alongside Rainier Tyson and Thons Kunders, tightening the web of intermarriage that would define Germantown's first generation. His descendants held onto Germantown land into the following century under the anglicized name Curlin. Number 9, Bleikers. Johannes Bleikers and his wife were somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, weeks from land, when their son Peter was born aboard the Concord itself, the only child on record to have entered the world during that 75-day crossing. Peter Bleikers arrived in the New World before the ship that carried him did. Number 10, Lucken, later anglicized to Lucans. John Lucken's sisters married into other founding families, the Seimens, the Toons, and the Kunders households, making the Luckens one of the most intermarried names in early Germantown. Generations later, a descendant of this same Lucken line, Rebecca Lukens, took over her late husband's failing ironworks on the Brandywine Creek in Coatesville, Pennsylvania. After his sudden death, left her a widow with young children and a mill full of debt. She ran it herself, rolled some of the first iron plate used to build American steamships and locomotive boilers, and built the operation into what became the Lukens Steel Company, one of the oldest continuously operating steel manufacturers in American history. Historians now call her the first female industrialist in the United States. A name that started with one of 13 weavers' families getting off a boat in 1683 ended up running one of the largest steel plate mills in the country. Subscribe to the channel right now because the next 10 names include the family that built the first paper mill in America, the man who organized this entire migration before he ever set foot on the Concord, and a surname connected to a sitting governor of Pennsylvania. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with me. Number 11, Toons, also recorded as Tunis and Clinken. Abraham Toons married Beatrix Lucken, sister of John Lucken, and drew lot 7 in that original land lottery, roughly 200 acres running along what is now Germantown Avenue. The house he and Beatrix built stood for generations, in a neighborhood that today still carries the outline of that original 17th century survey. and later records place a house belonging to a Frey family on almost exactly the same ground. 2 founding surnames from the same list sharing one small stretch of land 3 centuries apart. Number 12, Pastorius. Francis Daniel. Pastorius was not one of the 13 families on the Concord. He came from a wealthy, university-educated family in Franconia, trained as a lawyer, and sailed weeks ahead of the Krefeld families to prepare the ground, arriving in Philadelphia in August of 1683 to negotiate the land purchase before they ever landed. He became Germantown's first mayor, wrote its earliest legal code by hand, and in 1688 was the lead author of the document that Dirk and Abraham Op den Graeff would sign inside Thons Kunders' house, the first formal protest against slavery in the American colonies, the same document that would be buried in an archive for a century and a half before 2 separate rediscoveries brought it back into public memory. Pastorius kept detailed journals of nearly everything that happened in the settlement, which is the only reason so much of this story survived at all. Without his handwriting, most of what you are hearing right now would not exist in any record. Number 13, Rittenhouse. William Rittenhouse arrived a few years after the Concord and built the first paper mill in the American colonies on the banks of a Germantown creek in 1690, a mill that supplied paper for some of the earliest printed documents in Pennsylvania. His descendant David Rittenhouse became one of early America's most celebrated scientists, an astronomer, a mathematician, and the first director of the United States Mint under George Washington. A public square in the middle of Philadelphia still carries his name. The family that started by making paper in a creek-side mill ended up minting the nation's coins. Number 14, Van Bebber. Isaac Jacobs. Van Bebber followed his sister into Germantown in 1684, 1 year behind the Concord, joining a brother-in-law, Herman Op den Graeff, who had already married into the family he was about to join. The Van Bebbers became major landholders and merchants trading between Pennsylvania and the Netherlands, one of several families whose arrival within Germantown's first 6 years is now counted alongside the original 13 as founding stock rather than as latecomers. Number 15, Doerrs, also spelled Doors and Doors. Margaret Peters. Doerrs was the mother of the 3 Op den Graeff brothers, and she made the crossing with her sons at more than 60 years old. She died in Germantown in November of 1683, barely a month after the Concord landed, one of the settlement's very first deaths. An elderly widow buried in a country she had lived in for only a matter of weeks. Number 16, Custer, originally Custer. Paulus and Gertrude Custer came from Kaldenkirchen in the same Krefeld region as the Op den Graeffs and the Streypers, part of the same tight cluster of Rhineland Mennonite and Reformed church families who all knew each other and in some cases were already related to one another before any of them ever saw Pennsylvania. Gertrude Custer, in fact, was herself a Streypers by birth. Their son, Arnold Custer, stayed in Pennsylvania farming country. And generations down that same line, genealogists trace a direct descendant named George Armstrong Custer, the Civil War general and cavalry officer killed at Little Bighorn in 1876. A Rhineland dye family's name traveled from a Krefeld church record to one of the most famous surnames in American military history. Number 17, Telner. Jacob Telner never lived in Germantown himself, but it was Telner who held the original 1682 land grant from William Penn and sold 2,000 acres of it to the Op den Graeff brothers, while they were still standing in Krefeld before any of them had crossed the Atlantic. Telner had traveled to Pennsylvania once, met with Penn directly, secured the grant, and returned to Europe to arrange the sale from a distance. Without Telner's paperwork, completed an ocean away from the land it described, there is no Germantown to found. Number 18, Sipman, sometimes Sipman. Dirk Sipman was another Krefeld landholder whose name appears on the earliest Germantown property records alongside Telner's, a founding investor more than a founding resident. Sipman and Telner together represent something the passenger list alone does not show, that Germantown was financed and surveyed by men who never set foot on the Concord, working the deal from Krefeld while 13 of their neighbors risked the crossing itself. Number 19, Frey. Heinrich Frey arrived in Pennsylvania years before the Concord ever set sail, sometime between 1675 and 1680, writing letters home to his father describing a colony that did not yet officially exist under that name. He is remembered as one of the earliest German precursors in Pennsylvania, arriving before Penn's charter had even fully taken effect, the kind of name that predates the official founding story by almost a decade and rarely gets mentioned in it. Number 20, Cassel. The Cassel family arrived from the Krisheim region just a few years after the Concord. Part of the second wave that joined the original 13 families before Germantown's first decade was even complete. By 1689, families from Krisheim, Mulheim, Alsace, Switzerland, and Saxony had folded into the settlement, which means the true founding population of Germantown was never frozen at 13. It kept growing for years, spreading into the Skip Pack and Franconia farmland northwest of the original settlement, and the Cassel name became one of its earliest and most enduring additions. 300 years later, in 1983, the United States and West Germany jointly issued commemorative postage stamps to mark the anniversary of the Concord's landing. And in 1987, the United States Congress and President Ronald Reagan formally designated October 6th as German-American Day, the same date the Concord reached Philadelphia in 1683. A ship that most Americans have never heard of is the reason there is a national day on the calendar for the largest ancestry group in the country. 20 surnames. Two weavers who wrote 4 sentences against slavery at a kitchen table and watched the document vanish into an archive for 150 years before it resurfaced twice. A dye maker whose house hosted the writing of that document. A woman who died a month after she landed, in her 60s, having crossed an ocean for a country she would live in for only weeks. A baby born in the middle of the Atlantic before the ship that carried him ever touched land. A widow whose son was born after his father had already died in the first winter. A paper mill family that produced the first director of the United States Mint. A weaving family whose descendants ran one of the largest steel mills in American history. A dye maker's family line that produced a Civil War general who died at Little Bighorn. A merchant whose paperwork made the entire settlement possible before anyone ever set foot on the Concord. If your family has German ancestry and traces back to Pennsylvania, there is a real chance one of these 20 names, or one of their many spelling variants, sits somewhere in your family tree. The Genealogical Society of Pennsylvania and several Mennonite historical societies maintain searchable records for the original Germantown founders. And the Pennsylvania State Archives has digitized much of the original 1683 land survey. The records are public. The stories behind these 20 names are stranger, older, and more consequential to American history than almost anyone realizes. Subscribe to the channel right now if this showed you German American history in a way you had never seen it before. Every week, we go this deep into the bloodlines that built this country. Is one of these 20 names in your family? Tell me which one and how far back you can trace it. And if you have confirmed the connection through a genealogical society or a paper trail of your own, tell me that too, because that is where the real conversation on this channel happens. If your family has always said there was German ancestry from Pennsylvania without ever being sure exactly where it started, share this with them, because now you know the ship, the year, and the 20 names it began with.